Um, Thank you very much indeed for coming along. I'll say a very quick word about Huthwaite International. My name's David Friedman. I'm Associate Director of Huthwaite International. Like many of the people who've occupied this podium in the last couple of hours, we start by showing a picture of a country house. This is actually where our office is. And we really made our name by looking at the way people behave, the verbal behaviors they use. We started 40 years ago. We celebrated our 40th birthday last year. And we have accumulated this database of the way people interact behaviorally, verbally, in a variety of settings, particularly when they sell, negotiate, and communicate. The words you'll see on our stand just around the corner there, number I think 368. So let me begin by asking you a question. How many of you have at any time had any of these children? Good, that's a few. Or come to that, a spouse, partner, husband, wife, whatever, a few of those. Well, probably in order to get one, you have to have the other. Or ever attend any of these meetings? Okay. One of the common factors about all of these is that people need to be skilled at using verbal behaviors when they're in these meetings, and unfortunately the research seems to show year after year, decade after decade, in fact, they're probably not as much as they should be. One of the problems that people often find in meetings, internal, external, sales, negotiation, trying to persuade one another to do things in education, in learning, whatever environment they're in, is that logic is not persuasive. Put your hand up if you smoke cigarettes. Okay? I don't know if you've heard, but apparently it's not terribly good for you. And yet, millions of people still do it in defiance of a lot of the evidence, either because for chemical reasons or psychological reasons, but logic doesn't yet seem to have shaken their conviction they can carry on doing it. Similarly, just being right is not necessarily persuasive either. If anybody ever listens to the Today program in the morning or watches Newsnight, you'll hear two people going hammer and tongs about an important matter of the moment. Both will agree absolutely, both will be absolutely confident that their view is the right one, and they will try and persuade the other. Well, they won't actually succeed in persuading the other person. It's usually what we call a dialogue of the deaf, mainly because if people listen at all, it was once said that most people listen not to understand, but merely in order to respond. And what we really need to move towards in all walks of business, professional, and educational life is more understanding and less mere response. Proof if one's own perspective of being right is not necessarily always persuasive is here. If anyone's familiar with this famous picture, some of you will see a young lady with a feather in her hat. Hands up if you do that. And some of you will see an old lady with a pronounced chin and nose lower down. Hands up if you see that. Now, those of you who see one will be convinced that's what you're seeing, and you'll try and convince the other person, but all you'll really be able to say is just look at it for God's sake. See it the way I'm seeing it. But in a persuasion, in an argument, in any form of negotiation, we don't see it as the other person sees it. We can only see it the way we see it, unless we can use some behavioural skill to try and change that. So your perception is not always the right one. So we started to get interested in this some 40 years ago, and there are some very old pictures of our founders, roughly 40 years ago, a chap called Neil Rackham, whose books you might be familiar with, and some other people there, one of whom, Simon Bailey, Lynn is going to mention later on. One of the things that Neil got interested in way back was in the fact that if human behavior can be observed, it can also be analysed. If it can be analysed, then what makes successful people successful in a communication setting can be noted, can be analysed, and then could be trained on to other people. Neil was a great cricket fan, like me, but he wasn't a very good player, also, I'm afraid, a bit like me. But he did enjoy scoring, because scoring gave him the opportunity to note down what people were doing, how runs were scored, where they were scored, which batsman had scored runs off which bowler. And it came to him in a blinding flash that if you could do that for something like cricket, you could do it also in life. You could sit and observe people selling, negotiating, communicating with one another, and see which verbal skills they used that were effective in persuading the other person of their argument. And so we started to look at what it is that successful negotiators or educators or group learners actually do verbally. And if we reckon that if you could categorize those things, then you can start to see patterns. If you can start to see patterns, you can start to adopt those behaviors. If you can start to adopt those behaviors, you can start to be more effective. And we didn't just see individual patterns, and we'll show you some of those patterns in a minute, we started to categorize them into different types of behavior, because any meeting or conversation, however formal or informal, and whatever the objective, always needs, first of all, a set of behaviors that initiate, that get the thing moving, that put the ideas on the table, that bring them forward. And we'll look at those in a bit more detail in a second. Then they need another set of behaviors where those proposals and the builds on those proposals start to get looked at in terms of, well, will that work? Won't it work? How do we respond to that? How do we make that work in practice? Will the other departments be interested in doing it this way? And there's some behaviors under that. These are all part of the more than 100 behaviors, individual verbal behaviors, that Neil and the other researchers looked at the beginning and published back in the late 1970s, that are important in helping us to understand what goes on verbally in these meetings and what we can take out of those. Then clarifying, very important group of behaviors I'll say a little bit more about. These are the things you get to the point in the meeting where the suggestions have come onto the table, the proposals are there, people have said they disagree or they agree, they've tried to get under the skin, and then somebody needs to bring some clarity to it. It might be the person chairing the meeting, it might be others who take on that role. And there are some interesting tricks and subterfuges that people use when they're doing things like clarifying that can actually be almost a proxy for disagreeing or failing to support. And we'll come on to that in the end. And then finally, what we call the process behaviors, the sorts of behaviors that any meeting must have in order to make sure that it involves everybody, that it runs to time, and that something is actually achieved at the end of it. Now, it's quite important to say that no one of these behaviors that I'm going to go into a bit more detail is right or wrong in and of itself. But it's a question of balance, it's a question of context, it's a question of which sorts of behaviors you should be using when in order to get what kind of objective, and will flex depending on what behaviors other people in the room are using, when they're being difficult, whether they're being supportive, whether there's a lot of defend attack, and so on and so forth. Now, if we look at this first set of behaviors, the initiating behaviors, one that we talk about is called proposing. And the interesting thing about proposing, obviously a meeting will need a proposal to get things off to some kind of a start. One of the problems can be then that the discussion can quickly devolve in unskilled hands into a succession of proposals or counter-proposals. And then you get some kind of escalation of I want that, I want that, I want that, I want that, and deadlock arrives. What some more skilled people do, as we'll see a bit later on, is use some other behaviors, particularly what we call seeking information. Not to try and simply put another proposal on the table, but to try and understand what sits beneath, what lies behind a proposal that's been made, so that we can try and arrive at some sort of compromise, or at least an understanding of why somebody wants to achieve an objective, and instead of coming in with a counter proposal, possibly use some other behavior to try and reach an agreement or an accommodation in which both parties feel that they've won something. And that might very well be a build where you might say something like, I like what you've said there, but we could go further with that. Now that may actually be a skillful disagreement, but it turns it into a build which helps to preserve the climate, which is all important in successful meetings, negotiations, and learning environments. These reacting behaviors, well, there's open support, making a conscious declaration to say, I believe in what you've said, I support it, and signaling that in the conversations to come, you, if you like, have formed your way into that camp. But then there may be disagreements. It's very important that we are guarded in our behaviors, that we give reasons for disagreement. That first example, I'm afraid that won't work, the timetable isn't available, might actually be better off with a very subtle change. I'm not sure that the time is available for that, so I don't think it's going to work. So giving reason before disagreeing is often seen as less combative and less likely to lead to a deadlock and counter-proposal. I don't like that idea one bit. It's not perhaps the most subtle or skilled disagreement. And then what we have, these reacting behaviors. Now you might think that a defend attack is mere abuse. It can get that way. You're talking rubbish. Your third point is typically incompetent. When we sat and we observed people doing these things, we did come to the conclusion that any amount of defend attack above a very certain minimal level was not helpful. And in fact, when we looked at the most skillful negotiators, the most skillful communicators, we found that they had relatively very low levels of this behaviour. I'm not saying it should never be used, because sometimes frustration can get the better of one, and it may be the only way to get into the conversation. But again, we call disagreeing behaviours part of those reactions as well. And then the clarifying behaviours, and here a bit of subtlety comes in. Skilled interlocutors, skilled communicators and negotiators, people trying to get a learning environment going, use quite a lot of these. Now, they may be the person chairing the meeting. The person chairing the meeting will do quite a lot of testing understanding, as we call it, and also quite a lot of summarizing. In fact, if you look at the scores of people in a meeting and look at the level of summarizing, you can pretty well pick out who was chairing that meeting. Those are the kinds of typical phrases. A little tip around testing understanding is that that's often a skilled alternative we've found to disagreeing. So instead of saying, I don't like your idea, your proposal that we adopt this learning management system, I don't think we should, can often be used in a what we call an incredulous testing. Are you seriously suggesting that we use this LMS that's going to cost twice as much as that LMS when we've tried and tested that one for the last 5 years? So using what we call testing understanding, but in an incredulous way that actually hides what may be a disagreement. So those are all important behaviours. Why are they important? Sorry, just to talk about the clarifying behaviours, that seeking information is important as well. Remember, we said proposal upon counter proposal is not useful. It generally leads to a negative atmosphere and lack of progress. But if we can use what we call seeking information a great deal, that gets under the skin and starts to understand the objectives of why someone might have made that proposal in the first place. And giving information can be a useful behaviour, but it's also quite important to note that when we did the research, the less successful people had a much higher ratio of giving information to seeking it. People who walked into a room, a lot of ideas already formed, tended to give a lot of information and not be willing to understand what sat behind other people's concerns. So giving information is important, particularly when asked to give it, but it shouldn't be, as it were, the bedrock or the default behaviour for people trying to move towards some kind of agreed conclusion. Now, these process behaviours, what we call process control, if you like, are what, again, a chairman might use, or somebody else in the room who's conscious that not everybody in the team, and particularly in a learning environment, this is important, where some people might have sat at the back, either not contributing or perhaps worried about contributing, that someone else in the group might use a bringing in behaviour. And a shutting out behaviour, which might on the face of it sound like interruption or just giving information or making a proposal, and I'm not interested in what anyone else has to say. But sometimes it's a necessary and important behaviour, because, as I'm about to find out when Lynn looks at me askance in a minute, timing is quite important in meetings. There's no point letting it drag on, and sometimes if somebody's got the floor and someone in the chair or someone else who's got some influence in that meeting needs to say, no, we need to move on and hear what someone else has got to say. I think we should get on to item 6 on the agenda, or whatever it happens to be. So all of these behaviours are what we call process behaviours. And why are they important? Well, because in practice we use these things all the time. If you look at the list behind me, you'll see that persuasion, negotiation, meetings, learning environments, interviews, we found in context after context, setting after setting, that the people who have these behaviours in what we've profiled to be a successful balance tend to be the people who come out with the best results. We've just done an interesting global survey of 1,300 people in 52 countries of the way they analyse their own negotiation skills as they see them today, and it still holds up that the people who consciously and eventually unconsciously use these successful behaviours are the people who tend to get the best outcomes and are rated successful not only by themselves but by both sides in a negotiation and by colleagues in a learning environment. But it's not only about using these individual behaviours and being conscious of them, it's about being understanding of the strategy, the overall strategy you're going to use. We talk about push and pull. We talk about having an entire behavioural strategy based around the setting of objectives and using these types of behaviour. If you think about education, and everyone here is interested in education, think about the word education, educare, which is Latin for drawing out, the whole sort of Socratic idea of using questions to pull things from people. This pull style can be very effective in particularly when you have time to develop ideas together. Sometimes it's more appropriate that you have to use a push style, because sometimes the nature of the meeting or the nature of a class or a learning group you have in front of you needs some information in order to go to work on before you have that discussion. And so a push style can be appropriate. And we were actually able to sort of, if you like, classify what works best when. So push tends to work better when you have the power, when decisions need to be taken quickly or have already been taken, and you simply are communicating that information. Pull is much more for when you're trying to amplify and when you're trying to draw on the expertise of everybody in everybody in the room. Sorry, I've skipped through. Draw on the expertise of everybody in the room. You don't necessarily have the power to enforce the outcome unless you can demonstrate that it's come around as a result of some kind of consensus. Okay. There's a list of the effective persuasion behaviours. I'm only going to just finish by coming back to this idea of children, because it's relevant to what Lynn's going to say. These are the most successful persuaders there are, because they can use all types of unconscious competence that they seem innately to be born with to be able to persuade their doting parents and grandparents to do things that they want to do and you don't necessarily want to do, which proves, if nothing else, that these behaviours are relevant to people of all ages and at all stages in their development, which is my cue to hand over to Lynn.
Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Lynn Bianchi and I'm here from the University of Manchester. I'm here to speak about the partnership between some schools and the Huthwaite International and how we've worked together since about 2009 to explore how we can take the opportunities and learning from Huthwaite and everything that you've just heard Dave talk to you about, the VBA analysis and all of those skills, and how we can work with children. This came about at a time when we were looking at seeing how we could inspire science teachers in particular to explore how we could develop youngsters' wider skills, communication skills through the subject knowledge, so that we weren't just feeding them lots of stuff to do with science, but actually we were going to upskill them as employers for the future and employees for the future. So it was an innovative project. That's generally what we do at the University of Manchester. We are working with in-service teachers both at primary and secondary level to invigorate and provide inspiring opportunities for continued professional development. The education sector at the moment in schools needs that invigoration, and it was the partnership with the business sector which was particularly interesting for some head teachers in Sheffield, which was where this particular project ran. And we worked with teachers for about a period of a year in collaboration with mentors from Huthwaite. So I'd just like to take you through the model which we worked with the schools on, and a 4-stage model really that can explain how we did that. So one of the key things was to get teacher buy-in. It seems to be quite a common sales technique to try and get people hooked in and buying into the models of practice. So for teachers, this was pretty left field. It was something that they'd never experienced before. But we used the VBA training program, the same one that they would normally train salespeople with, and we looked to work with teachers both experientially and immersively over a 3-day course. Very much putting it into their hands and asking them to be co-creators and to say, okay, what can you do with these models which can help these skills be developed through the core curriculum, and to really enrich the way that you teach children. The mentors from Huthwaite were absolutely key to this development. We couldn't have done it without them, and I think for their side of things they were making sure that we weren't meddling too much with the behaviours as well. The first thing that teachers always want to do is delete half of them, rename half of them, or recategorise half of them, but actually giving them the wealth of experience from the grounded research was really powerful. We did work mainly to invigorate the children's learning, but what teachers actually ended up seeing was that actually if they applied some of these skills within their own staff meetings and their meetings with parents and cluster schools, actually their own personal performance could also be enhanced. So it had a significant impact on middle leadership development also with the teachers. Okay, so once we'd got the teacher engagement, justifying its place within the national curriculum was the next key thing to do. And to be quite honest, that wasn't that difficult. Speaking and listening is right across all of the new areas of the national curriculum. And the DFE provide us with some lovely bold statements about what we should be doing. Unfortunately, I don't know whether anybody's here today, they don't necessarily provide teachers that much inspiration or new stimulus about how to do that. It's just a very nice expectation. So what this provided was new stimulus, new interest and a new incentive to look at how we could use the expertise of Huthwaite and the teachers' expertise as well as pedagogical specialists to really look at how we could co-create experiences in the classroom. So this is where it really got down and dirty, you might say. Teachers got hold of it and we looked at how we could develop it. We resorted a little bit back to my own research during my PhD, which was very much into personal skills development. And three key things came out in terms of how this can best take place. The noticing behaviours and pattern seeking and categorising, which goes right back to the heart of how Huthwaite's research started. We just drew that into the classrooms, and teachers are very creative. So we had VBA bingo, VBA sentence starters, VBA hot seating. Kids were immersed in lots of talk and development of language. The development of language obviously is at the heart of all this and needed to be quite clearly addressed. But not only did we want them to just know how to speak in these different categories, we needed it to be massively valued. There needed to be a culture in the school that said actually these things are as important, if not even more important, than the stuff that you're learning in science, in geography, in history. Actually, we value this as a school. So displays, rewards, head teachers talking about it in assemblies, actually upskilling the majority of the staff, even the playground staff, that if a child was defending and attacking, which in fact the kids loved to do the most, they weren't sort of berated because they were talking back. Actually, we were saying, well, actually, well, I'm trying to encourage children to be more responsive, to be able to defend what they're doing. Typically, the boys were extremely attuned and very happy to attack a lot. The girls not necessarily so much. But we had to try and get that balance and make them realise that actually it was using those words wisely which was the best way forward. And that was actually a statement from one of the little girls herself, who actually explained to somebody else that this helped me use my words more wisely. There's lots of interesting information that we haven't got time necessarily to talk to you about today. There is a paper that if you'd like to take away is on the stand, but the statistical differences between the boys and the girls did come out as a quite interesting feature that I just wanted to mention. In fact, the reacting behaviours, most in particular the disagreeing behaviours, boys found actually absolutely fine with. They were very happy to disagree, whereas the girls more reluctant to. And I think that's just a social context. Girls didn't want to be looking like they were shutting children out or disagreeing because it wouldn't make them look like a friend. And in a primary classroom, that's an extremely important place to be. So we had to work a lot around the language and making them realise that it was the balance of behaviours that was most important. Giving the children real life and authentic experiences is something that Huthwaite has enabled us to do in bucket loads, really, and I suppose this is an opportunity to give a public thanks really to them to open their doors as a business and to allow the education sector in, to allow literally 30 odd primary kids to hijack their offices for the day, to offer them a summer school. Opportunities like that are few and far between, and if you're in the business sector and have got any chance to do that, I urge you greatly. The children benefited from going up to Huthwaite, working with their mentors, demonstrating their skills authentically and being treated like adults, which is, I know that particular little girl has gone up to secondary school and still maintains contact because it had such an influence on her. So the real power of this was enabling them to get out of the classroom and use the skills that we developed. You might like to watch an animation that's also there on both Huthwaite's website and also our own, which was again about how the skills can be used in practice. The children created a whole script using the behaviours and certain characters demonstrating different clarifying behaviours or initiating behaviours and demonstrating their learning in a very creative way. So I'm coming to the end of my section about how we interpreted VBA with 9 and 10-year-olds in quite a short time, but it was extremely valuable. And so, David, I'm going to hand back to you.
Just very quickly to make one closing remark, because I think we're pretty much out of time. We've got maybe time for one or two short questions. Just to say, if you're interested in any of actually, just to pick up on something Lynn said there about bringing kids into this whole behavioural palette, this whole behavioural portfolio. It seems to me there's never been a time when it's been more important. Partly because employers are saying to us, in fact, as clients, the kids coming through at the ages of 16, 18, or even as university graduates, because of the way in which people have started to communicate in the last 10 years using social media and online media, what you might call the traditional verbal behaviours that we've been talking about don't come as naturally, don't seem to be as practiced. People don't seem to be as competent in that area. And when they get into environments where they need to communicate either with one another in order to problem solve, floor patch, and reach some kind of conclusion and agreement internally, it's much more difficult than it used to be. And when they become customer facing, how much more difficult is it than it used to be? Because people just simply don't have those. They've got a lot of other skills, social media skills, communication in ways that perhaps we weren't taught when we were coming out of education into the world of work. But this is an area that I think is going to become increasingly important as time goes by, as it's not inculcated to the same degree in people's developmental and formative years. So that's really what I wanted to say. There's more information about both the school element of this and the business element of this over on, I think it's 368, our stand over there. Please come and ask us questions, pick up some literature, and if you are involved in education and want to talk more about this project, we'd be only too happy to help. I think we've got principally some 3 minutes for questions. If you have any questions either for Lynn or for me, or if they're really tough ones for Tony, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll be happy to see you later on. Thank you very much indeed for listening.